this session is called Glass Ceilings and Sticky Floors, which I'm sure will resonate with all of us here. So I look at 2018. If we look back on 2018, I think there's been a groundswell and there's been a real shifting tide. And we also have increasingly seen people who abuse their positions of power being held to account. That's a good thing. And yes, who are we holding to account? I'm afraid it is predominantly men. Please forgive me for the men. I'm going to ask for your forgiveness in advance, but I'm going to be quite provocative in these opening comments because, as Susan said, there's great work that's been done, but there's a hell of a long way still to go. The glass ceiling is still keeping us out of boardrooms, and it's ensured that there are more of you in those aforementioned positions of power. With hashtags like Time's Up dominating world headlines, it would be easy to assume that the fight has been won and the playing field is being levelled. And 2018 is the year of the woman. 2018, the year of the woman. And I would argue, and forgive me because I have very strong views on most things, that two unhinged male chauvinists have caused a riptide of change. And they are, of course, Donald Trump, with his talk of pussy grabbing, as well as the creep on the casting couch Harvey Weinstein, who sparked the Me Too movement. But the year of the woman, I'm sorry, I don't buy it. We're still underpaid, we're underrepresented, and quite frankly, everywhere you turn, there's a seemingly endless array of obstacles standing in the way of women achieving their best lives. And there have been, of course, great strides made by international women's rights movements over the years. And there's no place on earth where women have the same opportunities as men. Nowhere at all. We're not living in a fair or an equitable society. And as Susan said, for females in poorer countries, this inequality tends to be amplified exponentially in the most harrowing of forms. Women and girls around the world are still married off as children, or trafficked into sex slavery, or forced labour, and women are refused access in many countries to education and political participation, or they're trapped in conflict-stricken countries where rape is just merely a weapon of war. And around the world, maternal-related deaths are hideously high. And 1 in 5 of us, irrespective of country of residence, 1 in 5 of us have experienced domestic or sexual violence in the last year alone. In Russia, they decriminalised domestic violence just last year, provided that the beating doesn't cause bleeding or break any bones. I think we can blame Putin, Weinstein and Trump for many of these problems, but sadly, of course, it ain't that simple. So let's deal with some very harsh facts. The percentage of women in senior roles is declining. It's not going up, it's declining globally. Women still hold under a quarter of senior roles in the world. Even our governments haven't achieved gender parity. In the UK, home to our beloved Girton, women hold just 32% of seats in the House of Commons and 25% in the House of Lords. And here in the US, the reality, as you would expect, is even worse, with women holding 19.3% of seats in the House of Representatives. Now, I am not here today to deliver a depressing monologue about the sad state of affairs we're all living in. In fact, my intention is absolutely the opposite. Because today's session, I know, with this extraordinary array of women, is going to be inspiring. And I'm honoured, really genuinely honoured to be in the company today of an alarmingly impressive group of women who I'm going to introduce shortly. To lead, alarmingly impressive, not just impressive, but alarmingly impressive, to lead this very aptly titled Glass Ceiling and Sticky Floor conversation. And we're going to explore the intersectional world in which we live and how women's leadership and advancement have made clear and inspiring difference. But we need a truthful and accurate look at the world we find ourselves in. I think that's really essential if we're going to have this very honest conversation. So, there is a very simple fact. In this country, there are still more chief executives named John than female CEOs overall. That's quite staggering. That is quite staggering. Now, I'm a female CEO, and there are a number of female CEOs here. we're a bit of anomalies. And if you're a gay CEO, then I certainly am an intersectional anomaly at that. And I'm also a northerner, it gets worse. So if you were to believe the right-wing masses, and you'll forgive the expression, I'm up shit creek without a paddle. Now, sorry, I shouldn't swear on, I was told don't swear. Now, my fellow panellists, I said I'm going to introduce shortly, are esteemed exemplary leaders in their respective fields. And we're all Girton alumni, with the exception of Kavita, who joins us from Mount Holyoke. But we've got more than our education and success in common. Like everyone in this room, I'm willing to bet we've all encountered challenges, but that applies to men and women. We've probably encountered maybe even a bit of oppression. We almost inevitably have encountered some sexism and discrimination on the way, as we've clambered our way off those sticky floors and smashed our way through the ceilings. Now, when I was first asked to chair this panel, my first thought was, what on earth is intersectional theory and what on earth is my view on it? And I did what any self-respecting CEO would do, turn to Google. And it turns out that I'm not alone in feeling uncomfortable, because nobody quite seems to grasp what it does and it doesn't mean. And the more I read about it, to be honest, the more confused I became. In fact, the very woman who founded the term, an American professor called Kimberly Crenshaw, coined the term in the late 80s and has publicly stated subsequently that intersectionality has become both over and underused and that she barely recognises the term anymore. And she was a professor of critical race theory. And she can't absolutely define it, but as the panel chair today, I'm going to have a crack at it. And I didn't just go to Google to help me with this. I went to the O word, forgive me, Oxford. I went to the Oxford Dictionary. And it classified intersectionality actually really rather crisply and well. It's the interconnected nature of social categorisation such as race, class and gender, regarded as creating overlapping and independent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. Race, class, gender, overlapping, independent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. And that's what we're going to try and tackle and discuss today. We all experience, I think, oppression in varying configurations and degrees of intensity. And certain groups of people have multi-layered facets in life that they must contend with. Now, as I said before, I'm gay and I'm female. Two tags most don't hold simultaneously. Only 6.4% of chief executives are women at S&P 500 companies, 6.4%. And for those females who do manage to progress up the ranks, they can expect to have their hard work recognised with inequitable pay, a minimum of 22% less than their male counterparts. But that isn't only where the statistics are horrendous, because I, for example, am in a really good position despite some disadvantages I might seem to have because of the colour of my skin. A black man and a white woman make 74 cents and 78 cents to a white man's dollar. How can that be right? And according to the US Department of Labour, an African American woman will make 65 cents of that for every dollar a white man makes. And a Latino woman, you've got it, yeah, they earn a meagre 56 cents. Absolutely shocking. And if we zoom out to manager level positions, overall, despite making up 46.9% of the workforce in the US, only a third of manager level positions are made up of women, despite those women being more educated overall. And of those female held positions, it gets worse, only 4.1% are held by Latina women, 3.8% by black women, and finally Asian women hold just 2.4% of that third. So, in effect, the higher up the corporate ladder, the fewer the women altogether, let alone women of colour. Great. Now, understanding what it means to live...
Are you sure you're not trying to depress us?
Yeah. No, it gets good. But we've got to know the facts, and this is what we're up against. This is what we've got to continue to tackle. So, understanding what it means to live in an intersectional world is essential to combating the interwoven prejudices that people face in their daily lives. But getting a true grip on it is really difficult because there's no Académie Française fighting to protect its purity. Intersectionality seems to be the current sort of buzzword that is thrown out willy-nilly. And I'm not going to try and claw back sort of too much clarity, like I said, on what intersectionality actually means. But like much of the debate around women's advancement, there is a certain ambiguity to it. But what's not ambiguous, however, is the growing amount of research that shows us that women leaders make things a hell of a lot better. We know that businesses are more profitable, governments are more stable, families stronger, and communities are healthier. And there's a direct correlation between women leaders and peace and sustainability. Why, you might ask? Well, may ask. Well, it's certainly not down to the age-old idiom that women take care and men take charge. That's rubbish. And it's something we're going to explore in a minute. I think it starts off, and the belief starts with a simple fundamental truth about women experience life differently. And that experience influences the way we see problems and, of course, solutions. And studies have shown that women are more likely to be collaborative, inclusive, team-oriented, all traits scientifically known to be effective, and even more so in today's less hierarchical, fast-paced, innovation-driven world. Now, we don't know what the world would look like if women ruled the world, because we haven't yet been given that opportunity. But we do know that something isn't quite working at the moment. Now, critics can argue that there's not a lot of evidence to say that actually women would make a better go of it than our male counterparts. But we do know for a hard, cold fact that when women are in leadership positions or involved in key decision-making, and societies work better, and there's less instability and there's less violence. And that evidence does exist, very much so. Zenga Folkelman published a study in 2012 in the Harvard Business Review, which found internationally that women are considered far more effective leaders than men, citing globally that women, which we know we are an untapped resource. And comparing male to female leadership across a range of leadership skills, women were found to be better across the board in 14 out of 16 competencies. We rank higher in our ability to take initiative and to drive results, to champion change and inspire and develop others. We're better problem solvers and analyse issues more competently. We also connect the group to the outside world. And despite all this, we're found to fall short. This is really interesting. We're found to fall short in terms of confidence in our skills and abilities. How extraordinary is that? So our Achilles heel is that we aren't crowing with the same loudness, arrogance from the rooftops like some of our male counterparts. Now, there's some giggling then that went on because you know it's right. Now, of course, I'm biased. I'm a human being. We're all full of biases, conscious, unconscious bias. But I agree with Folkman, and I believe women make better, balanced decisions. Let's take the wealth gap. I like the wealth gap. And this is just a staggeringly appalling statistic. If it were up to women, do you think that the world's richest 8 men would control the same wealth as the poorest 50% of the population? I don't think so. 8. 8! It's obscene. Absolutely obscene. So, today, it's going to be uplifting. We're going to look to the positive. Now, I am CEO of GettyImages, so that gives me an interesting position to look at society. Because I get billions and billions and billions of searches that hit the site, that hits our site. So, and when you put into your search bar what you're looking for, you're giving me a degree of prediction. So I can start to understand what you're looking for. And I've seen a massive change in the 4 years I've been at Getty, and particularly around the concept of female rising. And our customers are looking for trailblazing images of women and stereotype defining girls. Well, I think those 4 years on, the female has well and truly risen. And we're seeing a massive increase for search time like female entrepreneurs, glass ceiling women, girl boss. My favourite term, actually, the search term is women protesting, which has seen a staggering increase of 1,600% year on year, or angry woman, which is up 300%. Well, there we are. And that's not just me. I mean, you can't comb over misogyny, can you? So, where to from here? So, Intersectionality is a relatively new term for the majority, and yet its message is one that surely any of us in this room can relate to. And we must listen and include everyone in the overall debate in all of our multifaceted and experienced glory. So, on the subject of debate and differing points of view, let me finally introduce my fellow panellists. Now, I'm going to start by introducing I'm not going to hold it against you, our first non-Girton alumni, because, you know, we're inclusive, we're women. So it really is a privilege to be joined on the stage by Kavita Ramdas, extraordinary lady who's actively engaged in advancing the power, visibility and voice of women and girls globally. She's currently serving as director of the Women's Rights Programme at the Open Society Foundation, and you're a globally recognised advocate for gender equity and justice. You've just been made president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women. I say just, no, you haven't. No. She has been president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women since 1996, and during her tenure has more than trebled their assets, as well as trebled the amount of countries they provide grants in advancing the rights of women globally. Fantastic. You're formerly a member of the Global Development Programme for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the fabulous work they do. And you currently serve on the Board of Trustees at Princeton University, the Council of Advisors on Gender Equity to the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, and on the Advisory Council to the Asian University for Women and the African Women Millennium Initiative on Poverty and Human Rights. Extraordinary influence and achievements. So I'm really going to look forward to your contribution to this debate. Thank you. Sitting next to her is Nikki Bush, who is General Manager of Mars Symbioscience, and that's part of the Mars Group dedicated to promoting health and well-being through bioactive. The most important thing we need to know lots of things about Nikki, and she said, I'm in charge of manufacturing. 8,000 people report to me, I manufacture chocolate. My goodness gracious, a real-life Willy Wonka. Fantastic. And the good thing is you've told me chocolate's good for you, so my kids can graze on chocolate and I won't tell them off. But you have had an extraordinary career. You're based in Washington. I know you're a real champion of science-based innovation, and it's really good to know that there's somebody of intelligence and substance in that city. Yeah, you're a member of the Women of Mars programme, and I know you do something which I suspect most of us do in this room, which is really important, which is coach and champion female leaders in your business. Thank you for being on the panel. Next to Nikki is Suit Fern. She's founder of regional Singapore law firm Stanford Law and chair of the international leadership team at Morgan Lewis and Bockius. Based in Singapore, she's been named more times than I care to count as a leading practitioner in numerous global publications, serving on the boards of publicly listed companies with listings all over Asia-Pac. You also sit on the board of the World Justice Project, which is an independent organisation working to advance the rule of law around the world. And you were awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by Asian Legal Business in 2007. Another Lifetime Achievement Award by the Chambers Asia Pacific in 2016. And you were the first ever, and there are a lot of firsts in this room, female recipient of that. And you also received the Lifetime Achievement Award by Euromoney in 2017. Now that's, forgive me, a hell of a lot of Lifetime Achievement Awards. Shows you're very special. Thank you. Next to Fern is Una Ryan, a biologist and entrepreneur in biotechnologies. She's conducted research on vascular biology, published over 300 papers, born in Malaysia to a British father who was interned in a Japanese camp during World War II, fled to England with your mother by boat, and where you studied before moving to the States to continue your education, which is where you're based today. Una was very keen when we talked before this panel to say, my life is dedicated to 3 focus areas now: investing in women, being a woman on boards, and translating science to art, so bringing new perspectives of science to the art world. So I'm really looking forward to your contribution. You've been recognised with an OBE for all the work that you've done in biotechnology, and you have again you rightly applauded and honoured the Albert Einstein Award for her development of new vaccines to combat global infectious diseases, the Cartier Women's Initiative Award for your work on waste water cleaning programming using blue, green algae and solar energy. Extraordinary career, and again, really looking forward to your contribution. And the last member on the panel is the wonderful Elizabeth Stribling, who's founder and president of the prestigious Stribling and Associates, an esteemed real estate brokerage and marketing firm that anybody will know if you're a New Yorker. Now, in addition to Elizabeth's day job, she's also chairman of the French Heritage Society, a Franco-American charitable society that aids in the restoration of buildings in France. There's got a few more to restore after the upheavals of the last few weeks.
Try the Arc de Triomphe.
And I know you also do. You look after buildings as well that have French inspiration here in the US. You also serve on the board of the Landmark Conservancy, on the board of the Women's Committee of Central Park, as well as the board of governors of the real estate in New York. Now, if this stream of achievements and commitments weren't enough, Elizabeth is also a decorated officer with the insignia of the National Order of Merit, as well as having had the additional honour of being decorated as an Officer of the Legion d'Honneur, the highest honour that you can be awarded by the French government. That's extraordinary. An extraordinary set of women. So, now we're going to start the conversation. We have 45 minutes, and we're going to discuss a few issues between ourselves, and then, if you're up for it, we're going to throw it open to the floor to ask questions. So, I'm literally going to go down the line, but I'm going to start with Elizabeth, if I may, and just kick off with a very general question, which I would like you all to answer, which is, you know, you're experts and leaders in extraordinary fields. So what do you make of today's subject? Sticky floors, glass ceilings. Elizabeth.
Well, I have been very fortunate in my career in a different, completely an area. I have always been an entrepreneur. I started off as a rookie real estate broker, 13 and a half years, and so that you're literally your own rainmaker. Real estate brokers are self-starters. And then when I founded Stribling & Associates in 1980, then I was trying to create a team, most importantly. I've always seen my firm as a team, and what can I do? I offer them the support. So we've created, I hope, a great ethos at Stribling. It's based on my motto, which is very simple. Just work hard and be honest. You're not going to get tripped up too much. So I have been very fortunate that way. That said, because I've never worked in corporate America and actually confronted the hurdles that Dawn is talking about. However, I founded Stribling Marketing Associates, where we help developers work with, I just saw Robert A.M. Stern at lunch today, work with their architects and help plan, sell, and create target markets for the great developers of New York. They're probably the toughest bunch of men and a few women in the world. But for me, I am a product only of women's education. I went to a school when I graduated called Miss Hewitt's Classes, now the Hewitt School, Vassar College when we were only women, and Girton College when we were only women. It gave me an enormous sense of confidence. And I hope that I brought that confidence in what I've done to others, because confidence inspires trust. And that's what I've tried to do in my work.
Thank you. Wise words.
My view of glass ceilings and sticky floors is it's best to ignore them. But if you can't, there are many ways you can overcome them. I, too, have a life as an entrepreneur, but I've also been in academia, have been in corporate America. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, not that much good. But I think that when you're the boss, you can make it right. So there weren't any glass ceilings in my companies or in my labs. a lot of dirty floors, certainly in the labs, but not really sticky ones. So I think that for me, instead of worrying about somebody who earned more than I did, it was to surpass them and become their boss and treat them well. And so I don't get too hung up on those things. And I also agree with Elizabeth that when you have a goal, like ameliorating some problem with a disease or developing a test or a vaccine or something, that's the goal. And if there are barriers in your way, whether they are built by men or otherwise, doesn't really change what your goal is. It's just another barrier. So my view is not to get too hung up on the words, but to look ahead. I think the biggest danger we have now, that we are focusing so much on the inequalities, is we shouldn't just be fighting for the level playing field or to get to parity. What are we going to do when we run the world? And I don't think we should sit back and think we've achieved anything when we just get to equal pay and equal rights and anything that we worry about. We've got to rule a better world. We've got to do it better. And that's going to mean helping our fellow women and men, and in my opinion, in everything I've ever run, bringing diversity of all sorts into that leadership team. So I don't want to see just a bunch of women running things. I want to see everyone who's really good pitching in.
Thank you.
I was born into an Asian family where girls are second class, and I was the firstborn child, and my mother was hugely disappointed, tried again straight away, and had her prince and heir after me barely 12 months later. So I was second class. And like many of you in the room, I hated it. I fought back. And that's one of the reasons why I made it to Girton. I just so enjoyed beating the boys. And I've made a career of it. I like beating the boys. I get a big kick out of it all the time. Like Elizabeth, I came to a point where I felt I wanted to do something much more entrepreneurial. I wanted to play by my own rules. So almost 20 years ago, I set up my own law firm, and it was great fun. And it was an ability to do things in the way I wanted to do it, with the kind of values that I wanted. And I think many women find that route, make it your own. And then about 4 years ago, I had the privilege of just merging it. I meant to have just a little firm where I was going to have a lot of fun. And I clearly lost the plot because I merged it with one of the largest firms in the United States, Morgan Lewis. And one of the reasons I did was because Morgan Lewis is led by a women chair. And we had so many values in common, things that Una talked about, things that we are ready to emphasize diversity, give women opportunities, and place women in leadership positions. And we've done so well for it. And I think that's one of the most important things that anyone in this room can do. Just create those opportunities for other women.
Thank you. Nikki.
Okay, so I suppose I'm now the Willy Wonka, right? So
Sorry.
I did mention it to somebody in the audience, and they said, "Well, you probably heard it. Why didn't you bring the candy?" And so, sorry about that. So I have spent my I was at Girton as a natural scientist, and then joined Mars as basically as a graduate trainee, and I have spent my career in what you would call the corporate world. And what I can say when I think about glass ceilings and sticky floors is that if I look at what's happened over the last, I can see 20 years in the corporate world, is it used to be, and I came up through supply and manufacturing and drove forklifts and was there, and that I felt like I needed to be kind of roughy-toughy and drink a pint as quickly as the guys did. And now what I feel is that it's been in the last sort of 5 or 10 years, it's been so much more releasing, because you can bring your whole self to work, much more so. And vulnerability is now seen more as a strength than a weakness. And And I certainly find that one of the things I've been able to do more around sort of breaking through and helping others break through, and those glass ceilings, is more allowing those almost uncomfortable conversations to happen. Like, I don't feel confident, or I don't feel like, I feel a fear of failure. And when I took over, I did head up all the head of all the different 31 factories around the world, and I was able to bring a woman plant manager in Dubai, which was, as you can imagine, in the Middle East. I put in 2 women plant managers in Russia. I put 1 in China. And one of the biggest things that I needed to get over with them was just this fear of, am I not good enough, or even to put myself forward. And I still have that myself. And so I think sometimes being able to have those conversations, and it's not just women that have those feelings, but in general, I do feel that we need to have those conversations in order for people to break through. So that would be my reflection on the conversation.
Thank you.
Salam namaste. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm always honored when I can represent Mount Holyoke in any way possible. I really feel as though I owe my life really in many ways. I came to Mount Holyoke after I had a quite a significant nervous breakdown after my second year of college in India, and I think that a lot of the times when we talk about people who we see who are successful, I think we don't often take a moment to understand that what you see is not always the whole story. And I would say that for me, this reflection about sticky floors and glass ceilings, like Lee, I think I was also born into an Indian family. I'm the oldest of 3 daughters, and people would always say to my parents, I was saying to Anita earlier this afternoon, that people would say, oh, what a pity, you only have 3 daughters, but you're young, you can still try for a son. And actually, I was very fortunate to have parents who would respond, we're actually very happy with our 3 daughters. And my father would say, I've had a vasectomy and I have no desire to have a son. And then he would add, any one of my daughters is better than any of your sons. So I was like, thanks, Dad, no pressure. For me, I think this question, in my life, I've been in a very different space than the space of business or corporations. I've spent most of my life within what I might call broadly a social justice and human rights space. And I wanted to take a little bit of issue with how we began, because I think there's a way in which you can portray sort of those of us who are privileged to now live in what is called the developed or the first world versus the status of women and girls in the rest of the world. But I would just humbly submit that, in fact, that is also much more complicated than you would appear. We had an Indian prime minister who we took for granted. I grew up thinking that women ruled countries. I don't think most of you in this room would have had that expectation, with the exception of Anita or Paresh. It never occurred to me. So I lived in a world where at once I was being told, oh, what a pity, you should have a son, and a world in which my father, who wore a white uniform and was a naval commander and led a battleship, saluted smartly to attention when this petite little woman, 5'3", called Indira Gandhi, walked by. So, these things are not really very black and white. So I think that's an important distinction. Also, the only country actually right now in the world in which women not only have parity, but have exceeded parity is Rwanda, and not a Western country in terms of women in parliament. So these distinctions of who has and who does not have power and whether women are, I don't think for me, certainly as someone who grew up in the so-called developing world, I would just like to say those are not always the same thing, which is not to say that women disproportionately in the parts of the world that are still extremely poor don't face extraordinary barriers. but it's not such a straightforward thing as to say, well, the West has arrived. You see from the examples of the Me Too crisis that you may have externally arrived at a set of rights that you have provided in your laws and in your constitutions, but your societies are disproportionately still male. Your cultures are disproportionately male, and I would warrant that a society which still celebrates goddesses has a good deal going on that you all don't actually have. So just to set the record straight, for me, on sticky floors and ceilings, one other comment, I think for me, a lot of what I find problematic around, I actually love the word intersectionality, and I have met Kimberly Crenshaw, and she's an extraordinary person, but actually the word came before Kimberly made it very prominent. It came in the global conversations that women's movements were having, in which we understood that if we were going to fight for the rights of any one group of people, we must also fight for the rights of others. So that whole notion of injustice anywhere means no justice anywhere, was something that the women's movements throughout the 60s, throughout the 70s, throughout the 80s made visible. And whether it was in Nairobi or in Beijing, the notions of intersectionality actually grew out of the global women's movement. Kimberly Crenshaw made them a commonplace understanding in the context of the United States, and a particular legal case that she battled inside the US. So for me, I would just respond by saying that my hope for us as feminists is that actually our struggle should not be a let me on to your playing field. Our question should be, what the hell kind of crap game is this? Yeah. What kind of crap game leaves 3 billion people living under $2 a day in the world? What kind of crap game doesn't allow men to choose what they would most like to do in the world, and expects that even for all of us to consider ourselves feminists, very few of us would be comfortable with the idea of women making money and men saying, actually, I'd much rather be home and look after the baby. Men are not even given that opportunity because they have also been confined by the notions of patriarchy. So I think, for me, the hope is that for us as feminists, we actually throw the whole damn game out and say, let's start afresh and let's create that world that we were talking about. A different world, as Arundhati Roy said, is indeed possible. And on a quiet day, we can hear her breathing.
Yeah. Thank you. So the obvious thing to pick up from that is, how are we going to do that? How are we, to sort of address what you said, Uni, you said, what are we going to do when women run the world? But before we get there is, how are we going to get there? What are we going to do? Because we know what these are, but how are we going to go about it practically to achieve a more equitable society? I mean, is it through quotas? And we know that quotas work. I mean, does anyone want to take a perspective on it?
I'm happy to go first around, because I think one of the things I've noticed, so Mars Incorporated is a privately owned business. It's been 100 years old, and one of the things that's quite interesting is that it's now on generation 4, and that's sort of the cousins. And of the generation 4, 7 of them are women. So 7 of the 10 are women. And so there's been, and one of the reasons I've stayed for as long as I have over the 26 years is because of that feeling that they really wanted to see more women involved. And what we have used quotas, but what happens if you just have quotas is you end up with the numbers, so you get the diversity of the numbers, but if you don't then encourage what I would call the inclusion, which is that people want to stay, and that a male boss can have a conversation with a female saying, look, you're going out on maternity leave, what about this? If you don't have those, teach people to have those inclusion conversations, then it doesn't matter, because you might get the quota, but then basically people leave, or the organisation almost rejects. So I'd say, for me personally, having seen it, and seen it in areas where it's hard, like in manufacturing or in science, it's hard to get women, is that, yes, quotas can be part of it, but then you have to help in groups, help people learn how to be inclusive, and what are the kind of more difficult conversations you have to help people prepare for, would be my thoughts.
Sorry, please.
I've always, I initially approached the idea of quotas saying, I don't like them. I want to be here on merit and merit alone. But it's a much more complex answer than that. And I deal in particular, for example, with quotas on corporate boards, which is something I'm familiar with. And I sit on 2 CAC 40 boards. And it's quite remarkable. What had happened was in Europe, in France, because of quotas, many large old companies were forced to renew their boards with women. And as I got to know some of the grand old men, part of the business establishment, who were on the boards, it was quite remarkable. Many of them eventually conceded to me, albeit in private. They said, when they first recruited you, you were the first woman, and you weren't even French. And
Quelle horreur.
there you are. And yet they said, after a while, they felt it was so right. They felt that they themselves were participating much more in the board. They were too ashamed not to come unprepared. They didn't know me, so they needed to be prepared. We had very healthy debates. They actually thought that they were getting a lot more out of the boards. The boards, the chair, the management felt that they were getting a lot more. So what did Dakotas do? They moved the needle and forced boards to look at people outside their usual pond that they would fish from. They forced them to look at talent differently. And for that reason, in many instances, I do think quotas are something to support, because quite often men just don't realize what they're missing without the quotas. But it is broader than that. It is something that we do very much in Morgan Lewis, and we're not quota-driven at all. But then when we look to recruit, when we look to promote, when we look to retain and find people for leadership positions, we mustn't just look at it as a standalone. But how can that individual interact with the team? And how can that person enhance the team? And when you look at it from that perspective, you don't want more of the same. You actually want diversity. And so there is a need to consciously not just create that opportunity, but to look at those opportunities differently, and not just who is that best person who's identical to the next person next to him, but how can we build the best team? And from that perspective, I think we can do a lot more in our organizations, big or small, to really move the needle, grow participation, and actually make ourselves better organizations.
Thank you. I've spent a lot of time worrying about this, because I had a conversation. I had spoken at UN Women's Day one time, and on the same panel was Gro Brundtland, the former Premier of Norway, and she felt very firmly that we should have quotas for women on boards. So I took this back to an organization I belong to, Women Corporate Directors. Some of you may belong to it. And there was a great deal of discussion, mainly negative. We don't want things that don't belong to us. We've seen the problems with affirmative action. But now we, that group, have managed to bring, in California, I think it's the first place, absolute rules about having women on boards. You know, the larger the board, the more women you have to have. What I want to be very, very careful about is that we as women see this as a continuum. It's just as I was saying before, the battle isn't won when we get women on boards. The battle is won when we don't need quotas anymore, because we have brought younger women or new people into the boardroom. And I don't want to see a time when we do the things that men did to us, where we keep other women out. So I think it's very, very important that we don't just have a sort of superclass of women who can sit on boards. I mean, I sit on 7 boards. And now when I'm asked, I say, I can't sit on any more, but I suggest you look at, and then I give out resumes of other women who may not yet have been on boards, but who want to be. It's very important for us to mentor them, help them, but also recommend them. They're never going to get into the pool. We don't want what we saw in Scandinavia, where, you know, the top 5 women had 17 boards because of the rules. So we have to manage this in perpetuity.
I'd like to agree with what you're saying now and what many of you have said, that perhaps it's not just a women's issue, but a diversity issue. A diversity brings a dialogue, it brings different perspectives, and that can be extremely interesting, gratifying, and motivating. Just on an amusing level, I've sat on a lot of boards, many of which are not even listed on my resume right now. And I remember about 17 years ago, the Foreign Policy Association took me out to lunch at the Carlisle Hotel, quite grand, and they said, we'd like you to be on the Foreign Policy Association. I said, what are you talking about? I have absolutely no qualification at all to be on the Foreign Policy Association. And do you know what their response was? They said, look, let's get it real straight here. You're a woman and you're a businesswoman. That's what we're looking for. And I said, well, on that note, I'll join. And now I live in France half the year. I have learned so much about foreign policy, and it has been extremely stimulating for me. I agree with what you said. They've got to take people differently. I sit on a lot of boards, but you don't want to hire just because you need the gay guy, the Asian, the white, I don't even know if I'm allowed to say all these token people. You don't want that. You want qualified, engaged people who can bring a different perspective. That said, I was sharing with Dawn that the number one 5 major real estate firms, residential real estate, are run by women here. The number 2 best commercial brokers in New York are the Stakem girls, okay? One does leasing, one does investment sales. You've got to be good at what you do. That's the most important.
Can I just ask, I know you want to come in, Kavasha, why are women so dominant in your industry? I mean, it's really interesting. The top 5
Well,
like
I'm
saying
talking
the
about
toughest.
residential, probably because women are very good negotiators. They want to find solutions. And if you're going to be a successful real estate broker, you don't just open doors, you close the deal. And that's, I think, where women are very good. Also, I think we've got a one leg up here. Let's face it, you're selling homes. And even though they might be multi-million-dollar homes, they're still not a stock or a bond, they're a home. And I think that comes into a lot. The other thing is all of the real estate brokers in the residential area are on strictly commission. They need so much hand-holding. They need so much encouragement. They need so much love and also motivation. And women are very good at all of that.
Thank you. Sorry.
I guess I'm not, again, I mean, I'm just struck by for me, when you said the word quotas and when you said, well, what are we going to need to get to this other world that's possible? Here are the points that I think we have to do to be able to get to that world. So one, you have to support women-led movements. I don't know how many of you are aware that some of the world's most extraordinary movements, and it wasn't an accident that Susan's scarf said, wisdom, not weapons. The Nobel Peace Prize exists because a woman, Baroness Bertha von Suttner, persuaded Alfred Nobel that after having discovered such a dangerous thing such as dynamite, he might actually do some good and create a peace prize. She went on to actually win it, but she was a pacifist who wrote an extraordinary book in German called Lay Down the Weapons. So peace movements have been led by women. Right now, environmental movements across the world are led by women. Movements to end harmful dams, movements to stop nuclear irradiation, movements to ban the use of uranium. All of the mobilization that you saw around the Kavanaugh hearings. In India, extraordinary movements to protect indigenous people's rights, labor rights. So I think one of the first things we could do is to do a lot more to support women-led movements. And just a number from my field, right now, only 6.7% of all U.S. philanthropy goes to organizations led by women and girls. So you gave that other number of less than 1/4 of senior roles, women. So, this is another sort of extraordinary percentage. Second, support women feminist economists. Women we have an extraordinary field of feminist economists. We know by now that the current economic system that ended up with 8 men owning more than 50% of the rest of the world is not sustainable. It is not sustainable climate-wise, it is not sustainable socially, because this level of discontent, you think those yellow vests on the street of Paris are just tearing down monuments because it's fun? No, because the level of desperation that this kind of inequality breeds is extraordinary. You think that migration is happening out of sort of no reason whatsoever? No, it's economic desperation. We have a situation, and we are all complicit in it. We can't just blame those 8 men. An article in The Atlantic recently talked about the 9.9%. It's not just the 1%. It's all of us who are actually benefiting from that, even as we prevent people from having labor unions. Those of us who belong to associations of lawyers and doctors and real estate owners are happy kind of providing that for ourselves and not actually standing up for the rights of workers and people on the ground. So that's a second. Third, I think we have to remember that feminism is not something that has to do with what we have between our legs. Feminism is an ideology. It has to do with what is between your ears. And men can make extraordinary feminists, and many of them are. And actually, it is high time that we actually mobilize for a movement that didn't talk about women and men, because there are plenty of women who have completely bought into the ideology of patriarchy and frankly do not do anything for us to be able to sort of shift the reality or the terms of ground. So let's support feminist thinking, and let's not make such a big deal about what our sex was, basically on how we were born. Let's talk instead about gender the way we actually understand it now in the 21st century, which is about our identities and about the ways in which we actually feel comfortable or not comfortable in those socially constructed roles. Lastly, we do need more women to run for political office. I don't care if we don't agree with their politics. We have had plenty of stupid men running for all kinds of different positions, and we don't kind of hold them to the same ridiculous standards that we do for every single woman who happens to hold that office. So we do need more women in those positions of office. And I will say on the issue of quotas, I thought about what it meant in India to have 30% of village council seats reserved for women, which happened almost 20 years ago now in India. Read any World Bank study and you will see that within 10 years of that, actually even less, within 8 years of that, the sea changes in what the ground realities were: more schools in villages, more clean water in villages, more wells in villages, more girls going to school in villages. When you have quotas being able to be used for the purposes of allowing people to see that people who have systematically been excluded from particular positions are now essentially, I think of quotas as reparations. Okay, you had a system that was actually hugely damaging, hugely discriminatory, and now you're making up for having recognized that all those years of colonialism or all those years of slavery or all those years of patriarchy actually deserve reparations. So I'm not ashamed to take those quotas. Let's take them, let's run with it, and I agree. Let's not replicate the silliness that we've had in a male-dominated world. Let's create a different one.
Well said. I love the idea of quotas and reparations. Yeah. So those quotas will all...
I just wanted to supplement, and Kavita's got me going on this.
I want to throw it over to the floor in a minute.
She's got us all going. Which is, you asked, what is the solution and how can we make the difference? Surely for the group here, it is education, and higher education for women. And that access to higher education must be just right top of our agenda. And I'd like to recommend a book which is just out this year, which I think is extraordinary. It's called 50 Million Rising by Sadia Jidi. And it's about Muslim women gaining independence and control. And a lot of this has been through drives to increase access to education by women. And I simplify the arguments in the book, but I think that when you talk about that large number of Muslim women, and any women, non-Muslim as well, across the world, it is that access to education. Quotas I agree with completely, but it's the access to education that is transformative. I know myself that had I not gone to Girton, had I not had an education, I wouldn't be talking about quotas on corporate boards in Europe. I'd be trying to sort of struggle on a pig farm somewhere in China and be an awful pig farmer. And it is actually the education that makes the difference. And it's not just that opportunity of access. Kavita pointed out a very important point, and it was touched on in this book as well. The book talks about the powerful revolution that is transforming economics, cultures, all over, from countries from Pakistan to Indonesia, but elsewhere as well. And that is through education. And the challenge is patriarchal norms, often by women as well, create a very strong pushback. And there are men out there, and I think we need to have that conversation, who are struggling, who may be supportive, but who are struggling to keep up with the change. And that's something else we need to think and talk about.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. You've got 10 minutes. So just before we throw it open to the floor, as Susan said, we've got our honorary fellow, Anita Desai, who's a very well-known author in our midst as well. Is there anything that you would like to add or comment on, Anita, before we throw this to the floor for questions?
Pointed out that a male writer gets so much more attention than a female writer, and a completely different kind of attention altogether. And it's not a level playing field there at all. Male writers get much more place in book reviews and journals, and women have been protesting about this. But I think we're going through something of an unfortunate phase at the moment. Because this has been pointed out, it doesn't mean that a woman should get her book published no matter what.
Yeah.
And women have to achieve that excellence, which allows them to, ask for the same amount of attention. And this, of course, is where education is so terribly important, and higher education and excellence in education. But it starts at the ground level. Let's have lots and lots of books and put them in the hands of small children. But it goes all the way up to the top, so that a woman writer has the capacity to excel as well and compete as well.
Hello, I'm Ariel Spiker. I did my MPhil at Girton, and thank you. This has been a lovely debate. I work in human resources. I lead the human resources team at a large hedge fund. So I both support a team of women, largely women. Pretty much everybody in human resources tends to be women, and I work for a largely male-dominated field, largely male-dominated, organization. And I am raising a 5-year-old, very spirited girl. I would love your advice on when you talk about education and access to education. I couldn't agree more. I was fortunate enough to go to an all-girls school prior to university, but it strikes me that what I used to believe was important and necessary for higher education may have had some gaps in it. For example, I didn't learn to fail, and to fail well. There was a certain courage, I think, that I didn't learn because I wanted to do well, follow the instructions, be the perfect model, student. And as I think about educating my daughter, as I think about preparing women to be portfolio managers and lead hedge funds, it strikes me that being good at the classics or being a PhD in history is all well and good, but there are some other things that we need to accomplish. I would love to hear from you. What other things have contributed to your education, and what access to education, very specifically, do we need to offer both men and women in the future?
Good question.
I'm happy to go with just one thing that popped into my mind. I have a very spirited 19-year-old daughter. And what I would say is the one thing I wished, and I think I've learned, is the ability to say no. I think I wrestled with that word for about 40 years of my life, that I didn't manufacture guilt every time I said it to somebody else. I think I delayed the word and therefore would keep pressure on myself. And so my advice to you and your daughter is certainly being able to say no with you know, whether you're giving an alternative, don't fester on it when your gut says that this isn't something you can take on. And offering alternatives in terms of less of your time and effort. So if somebody wants you to do something for 3 hours and you can offer them 15 minutes, then, you know, great. Or somebody else who you believe, I think, as you said, around offering someone else for the board, right? But I think that ability to say no is certainly something that if you don't have it, and having not had it for a long time, you can overcommit. You can let normally yourself down, because you won't let others down, and you can go into some form of burnout. And I think that would be one of my pieces of advice.
I would add. I have a 25-year-old extraordinarily spirited daughter, so this is like a trend over here. She grew up playing soccer. They call it soccer in America. We call it football. She grew up playing soccer from the time she was, I think, 5 or 6. And I would say one of the extraordinary things about what is called Title IX here in the United States is that young women of her generation had exposure to sports. And I had that by happenstance because I lived in Germany during my teenage years, and I had a father who would go out with me early in the morning. I was a sprinter and a runner, and he taught me how to throw bloody hard. And he taught me this is a silly thing, but it's not actually, because we're not taught to also be proud of our bodies and to be strong in our bodies. And so I think there's a funny way in which the messages we internalize as women about being ashamed about our bodies and seeing our bodies as a place that we have to cover up and sort of hold in a particular way, or have it be revealed for other purposes in a different way. We're never actually taught to be completely at ease in our bodies. And I think exposing your daughter to sports, rough and tumble sports, is one of the most wonderful things to change her own sense of herself. Even the way she walks into a room, I notice the way my daughter carries herself when she walks into a room. She just commands the room because she's used to sort of standing in a way that isn't sort of this, I'm sorry, I'm taking up space kind of thing, which we're all taught from a very early age, just because we pick it up in the atmosphere. So that's what I would add.
I'm going to come in from a slightly different perspective. My daughter is now running my firm with me, and she's really smart and really spirited. I gave her a hell of a lot of freedom growing up. I didn't sit by her every night to make sure she got whatever the highest score is on the SAT. Yep. I said, it's up to you, kiddo. Yep. Wing it. Make it happen. She did not go to Vassar or Holyoke. She chose to go to the School of the Holy Cross, the College of the Holy Cross. She got a fabulous education, changed her life. But she says to this time on, Mom, you gave me the ability to be independent. Don't program your child only to achieve.
Yeah. I'd like to add one more, different one. And unlike the rest of you, I'm not so privileged. I'm the mother of 3 sons. And I learned something from having sons and living in a male household, which I think is well worth sort of teaching your daughter. And that's a level of resilience. Because I think I heard that from you, that we women often agonize too much when we fail. And we need it to be perfect or we're no good somehow. And the boys, they flunked. Or they flunked a test, they failed, they lost the game, and they shrug it off. It's no big deal. It doesn't bother them one bit. They pick themselves up in a nanosecond, and they're back. They're back on the field, they're back playing the game. And I think that if you could teach your daughter that resilience, or what the Americans call grit, that would be extraordinary.
We like gritty women, please.
I have one more. I have 2 very accomplished daughters and 4 very spirited grandchildren. But one thing my mother taught me, I think, is very, very important. I was born in an air raid shelter. We were torpedoed before I was 6 weeks old. I'm an only child, so I didn't have to fight with brothers or anything like that. But after I got my first divorce, my mother said, don't ever depend on somebody else. So my message to my daughters always was, be able to stand on your own feet. And as you know, the ticket to that is education. But I think that ability to stand on your own feet would dispel some of this dependence on having to get married, dependence on having to have a man look after you and pay for things. So teach your daughters to stand on their own feet.
My name is Amalia Sirica. Thank you so much. I'm a bit of a tag along. My brother went to Girton. He graduated last year, so he brought me along because he knew, and he was absolutely right, that this has been amazing. So I'm a social worker, and something Kavita said at the beginning about this whole idea of sort of how we view things from our Western perspective. So I sort of wanted to ask a question about how you all would best go about this whole idea. You know, something I see a lot is people arriving somewhere thinking that they have the answer on what would be best for that place, as opposed to sitting with the community and speaking to them about what would be best for them. So translating that also to, as women that are looking to mentor younger women, how you sort of balance mentoring without doing for them, which is hard. I know for me personally, I get so excited and I want to help, and so I guess in your careers, how that balance is sort of, and just not, I don't know what the word would be exactly, just not assuming that we know best, essentially. Thank you so much.
Well, certainly in the real estate industry, and I do this all the time, you're helping your brokers, you're helping them try to motivate to find their solution. And what I've found over the years, it's the dialogue that counts. They will come up themselves with the answer if you have a real meaningful dialogue. And I think everything we've been talking about today really is on the exchange, motivation, the dialogue, the diversity, etc. So ask a lot of questions, and they'll come up with the answer.
I would say, I think my experience of both, I think this, in part because of the fact that we do live in such an unequal world. Those of us with the privilege to, quote unquote, be in a position to either mentor or help or whatever, are often sort of, we're also socialized into thinking that somehow, because we have grown up with that privilege, that somehow we have the answers. And in fact, I learned this the hard way as an 18-year-old. My mother sent me off to live in a small village in Bihar, which is one of the poorest states in India, for 3 months. And, I thought I was coming to, save the people, basically. Somehow in my head, I had this thing that here I am, I've left my nice house in the city, and I've come. And at some point, I was trying to help with, when you have to winnow the rice and the chaff comes out, and it's hard. You have to hold it in a basket and do this, and of course I was dropping it all over the place. And this older gentleman from the family called me aside, and he said, "Beta, daughter, why are you here? Why have you come?" I said, "Oh, I've come to help you." And he looked at me and he said, "You're really creating more work. You're dropping all the rice on the floor." And he said, "You can read and write, right?" And I said, "Yeah, but I want to live here and help you." And, he said, "Actually, it would be a lot more helpful for us if you use your power of reading and writing to talk about what we go through here, how unfairly we are paid, why landless laborers cannot own land in this part of Bihar, why women are forced to sit outside in the small huts when they have their periods. If you really care, why are you not using the skills that you have, rather than assuming that you're here to kind of help us?" And it was a very big shift also in my understanding of privilege and power, because we may not all be born with privilege and power, but power and privilege are constantly shifting, and depending on where we are, we have or we don't have that ability. And when we can have the power to open a door, keep it open, help bring a chair to the table, rather than speaking for other people, which is a different thing, rather than claiming, can we create spaces for them to speak in their own voice? And I think that's the way in which I would approach this.
So I'll add just one piece because I was fortunate enough to go back to Georgetown University in 2011 and become a fully qualified executive coach. And having been at that time a leader of 8,000 people and thinking, oh, I'm sure I know what I'm doing here, I found it very humbling because I was videoed and they said, you did nothing but talk. You talked over people, you didn't ask. And one of the things I realised through that whole process of what was about a year of intense work was what I needed to do much more of was to say, what does success look like for you in this? What does success look like for you in this conversation? What does success look like for you in this relationship? And then shut up and listen.
Yeah, no. Well, that's very powerful. I mean, I always say to my colleagues, and I have to say, men are particularly bad at this, is you're born with two of these, and one of these. Use them in proportion. It's really important. Don't overtalk. Observe and listen acutely, because you can be so much more powerful by doing that.